The first mention of Ren Ashcombe in her uncle's new land deed was meant to be a private matter, a clause folded quietly between acreage and easements, where no one outside his study would ever think to look. But Ren heard every word of it through the 2-inch gap he had forgotten to close. She did not drop the tin box she was carrying against her hip. She did not press closer to the door to hear better, though every part of her wanted to. She did not make a single sound that might have told her uncle his niece now knew precisely what she was worth, on paper, to the county of Fenmark. Ashcombe Grange stood 2 miles east of the river that autumn of 1815, its chimneys smoking with the same dutiful industry as every other morning, as though nothing inside its walls had just quietly rearranged the order of the world. The house did not pause. Houses rarely do, when it is only a girl's worth being decided inside them. Beyond the study door, Josiah Ashcombe's voice moved on to timber rights and a boundary hedge, as if he had not just said what he had said, and the solicitor's pen went on scratching, patient and unbothered. The sound of a man being paid to find nothing objectionable in anything he was asked to write. The word her uncle had used was encumbrance. Not niece, not ward, not even girl, which would at least have granted her a category among living things. Encumbrance was a word for debts still owed on a property, for a right-of-way that inconveniently crossed good land, for anything that reduced a parcel's value and had to be noted so no purchaser could later claim he had not been warned. It was, Ren understood with the particular calm that comes only after a wound has already landed, the single most honest word anyone in that house had used about her in 3 years. She stood in the corridor with the tin box warm against her palm and did not go in. There would have been no use in going in. A drawing room can be made to believe almost anything so long as the person harmed does not insist on being believed, and Ren had long since stopped insisting. The corridor itself seemed built for excluding her, she thought, in the mild, unhurried way she thought most things now, without heat. The way one might notice that a coat no longer fit rather than that it had been taken away. The portraits along the east wall were all Ashcombe's by blood and marriage, who had died with land in their names. There was no portrait of her mother, who had married into the family and brought nothing but competence, which the family had used freely and never once framed. The fires in this passage were never lit before noon, though the drawing room's fire burned from 8. She had learned, the way a person learns the position of furniture in the dark, exactly which rooms in her own home would be warm before she reached them, and which would not, and she had never once asked why. Because a person who asks why she is cold in her own house is inviting an answer she cannot afford to hear aloud. Inside the tin box, which had belonged to her mother and now rarely left Ren's apron pocket, 3 dozen paper seed packets sat folded in a hand gone soft with age, each one labeled in ink that had faded from black to the brown of old tea. Larkspur and columbine and a squash her mother had sworn came from a market town nobody in the family could ever afterward locate on a map. It was not a fine object. The lid had a dent in one corner where it had once been dropped down a flight of stone steps by a mother who laughed instead of apologizing for it, and the hinge complained faintly every time it opened, a small domestic sound Ren had come to find steadying in the particular way a heartbeat is steadying, mostly because one does not notice it until it stops. She had been on her way to the kitchen garden when she overheard her own price. That, more than anything, seemed to her afterward the truest measure of the morning. That grief of that size could arrive to a person mid-errand, between one task and the next, and that the person could simply keep walking once it had landed, because the beans still wanted staking and no one else in the house would think to do it. No thunder marked the moment. No curtain fell, No clock struck some symbolic hour to announce that something in the shape of her life had just been altered without her consent. The music of an ordinary morning, the clatter of the scullery, a dog barking twice at nothing in the yard, resumed within a minute, as if cruelty, once spoken, required no further comment from a world that had heard a great many worse things said in kitchens and studies, and had learned long ago not to interrupt its own routines for them. 3 years earlier, there had been a different door, in a different season, and a different kind of silence on the other side of it. Edmund Ashcombe had died of a fever in the space of 9 days, quickly enough that the household barely had time to be frightened before it had to be grieved, and because the Grange had come down through the male line for 4 generations without deviation. The entail passed everything, house and land, and the modest debts that came attached to both, directly to Josiah, the elder brother who had spent most of his adult life resenting that Edmund's had been the better inheritance to wait for. Wren, 21 years old that autumn and her father's only child, inherited nothing but a small annuity too slight to live on alone, and a guardianship she had never asked for. The law was not unkind to her by design, it simply had never been written with her in mind at all, which amounted, in practice, to the same thing. It is a peculiar arithmetic, the narrator might have observed had anyone been listening, that a household can run for a decade on a daughter's labor and still record her, when the accounts are finally totaled, as a cost rather than an asset. Her mother, Lucy, had died 9 years before that, when Wren was 12, of the kind of illness the doctors of Fenmark called a wasting and treated with bleeding and useless confidence, and it was from her that both the seed tin and its accompanying doctrine had come. Wren still remembered her mother's hands with a clarity that had never dimmed the way faces sometimes dim, broad-knuckled hands, sun-brown to the wrist and pale above it, forever smelling of crushed mint and turned earth, folding a paper packet closed with 3 practiced motions, while Wren watched from a stool too small for the kitchen table. The soil does not choose its seed, Wren, her mother had told her once, kneeling in the very bed of columbine that still bloomed each June along the south wall. Not because Wren had asked for comfort, but because Wren had been crying over some small childhood slight she could no longer remember the shape of, only the ache. It only learns, in time, to make room. Her mother had said it lightly, the way she said most true things, as though laying down a card in a game rather than delivering a lesson, and had gone back to her planting without waiting to see whether the words had taken root. They had. Wren had carried that sentence the way other girls carried lockets, worn smooth from handling, produced silently in the dark hours when the house's arithmetic grew too loud to ignore. It was, she sometimes thought, the only inheritance no one could enter into a ledger, because no one else in the house had ever heard her say it aloud, and a thing kept unspoken cannot be assessed for its value and found wanting. By the time she was 21, Wren managed more of Ashcombe Grange than anyone in it would have cared to admit aloud. She kept the household accounts in a hand steadier than her uncle's, having taken the task over quietly 2 years before, when his own arithmetic began arriving short at the bottom of every column. She walked the tenant farms twice a month with a satchel of seed and a memory for which fields had been sown too heavy with clay the previous year, information the estate's official steward, a genial and largely ornamental man named Mr. Pell, absorbed from her over tea and later repeated to Josiah as his own. She had, the previous spring, quietly diverted a flooding culvert along the eastern boundary before it could take out an entire planting of barley, working alone in the rain for 4 hours with a spade and a lantern hung on a fence post, and no one in the house had ever learned of it, because there had been no ruined barley to explain, and therefore no story to tell. No one saw. That, too, was familiar. A kind of ledger existed in Wren's mind alongside the household's official one, an unwritten column of crises quietly averted, debts of gratitude that would never be called in because no one knew they were owed, and she had stopped sometime in the last year expecting the two ledgers ever to be reconciled. It is a peculiar cruelty of certain households, the narrator might have said, that they will consume a person's competence entirely and still describe her, at breakfast, as a burden they are generously enduring. Breakfast that particular morning was held, as it nearly always was in fine weather, in the small yellow parlor whose windows looked out over the very water meadow that had occasioned her uncle's morning conference with the solicitor, and Wren arrived at the table already composed, the tin box left upstairs, her face arranged into the pleasant blankness she had long ago perfected for rooms she could not leave. Aunt Prudence sat at the foot of the table in a morning gown the color of clotted cream, pouring tea with the unhurried authority of a woman who had never in her life doubted her right to a chair. Cousin Delphine, golden-haired and quick-tongued and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from having never once been told no by anyone whose opinion mattered, was already midway through an account of the previous evening's card party at the Fenmark Assembly Rooms, an account that turned, as her accounts so often did, toward Wren without any apparent effort at all. "Someone asked after you last night, cousin," Delphine said, setting down her cup with a small, precise click, "though I hardly knew what to tell them, since you never come. I told them you were far too occupied here to be spared for dancing." It sounded warm. It was delivered with a smile bright enough to be mistaken for kindness by anyone not required to live inside its aim. The pressure beneath it was not warmth at all, but a reminder, delicately administered before witnesses, that Wren's absence from every assembly, every supper, every occasion where a young woman might reasonably hope to be seen was not an accident of circumstance, but a fact the family had quietly arranged and now wished credit for narrating gently. Prudence added her own contribution without looking up from the teapot. "It is only sensible," she said. "There is no sense in a girl attending assemblies she cannot be properly outfitted for, is there? We would only be inviting talk." It was not a question. Wren buttered a piece of toast with great attention and said that she was very content at home, which was true in the way that a rehearsed answer is true, worn down until it no longer costs anything to say. She could, had she wished, have observed that the outfitting Prudence referred to had never once been offered in the 3 years since her allowance passed under Josiah's management, that the annuity meant to clothe and keep her had instead clothed Delphine for 2 full seasons running, while Wren's own gowns were let out and turned and let out again by her own hand at night by candlelight. She could have said any of it. She catalogued, in the silent half-second before she spoke, every version of the truth available to her, weighed each one for its capacity to wound, and set every single one of them down again, choosing instead the smaller, humbler sentence that cost her something and cost the room nothing. Because a girl without a home of her own does not spend her only leverage on the satisfaction of being right at breakfast. Delphine's eyes flicked toward her mother, a small private exchange of amusement neither of them troubled to hide, and the conversation moved on to the day's true business, which was the boundary walk expected that afternoon, when the Duke of Rathbourne's steward was to come and go over the disputed water meadow with Josiah and Mr. Crane before any deed could be finally drawn. "There will be gentlemen present," Prudence said, in the tone of a woman issuing instructions rather than making an observation, "so you will want to make yourself useful in the kitchen rather than underfoot, Wren. Since we cannot have anyone forming the wrong impression of the household." It was, on its surface, a request about lemon cakes. Underneath it sat the old familiar arithmetic, restated in fresh clothing, that Wren's presence among people of consequence was itself a kind of risk to be managed, an encumbrance, though of course no one at that particular table would have used the word twice in one morning. Wren said of course, aunt, and meant beneath it something else entirely, though she had grown so practiced at the art of meaning something else entirely that even she sometimes lost track of where the surface ended and the truth began. The water meadow in question lay along the eastern boundary of Ashcombe land, a wide, slow-draining stretch bordering the far larger and far wealthier acres of Rathbourne, seat of the Duke of Rathbourne, whose family had held that country for longer than anyone in Fenmark could reliably account for, and who had, until recently, shown no particular interest in a strip of marshy Ashcombe grazing land worth more in argument than in rent. That had changed in the spring, when a new survey suggested the water meadow's drainage, properly managed, might feed a mill race the Duke wished to build a mile downstream, and Josiah, drowning quietly in debts no one at breakfast was permitted to name aloud, had seen in the Duke's sudden interest something very close to salvation. A sale, or failing that a long and generous lease, would settle enough to keep the Grange solvent through another decade of Delphine's seasons and Prudence's teapots, and it was towards securing that sale, by whatever clause could be made to serve it, that Josiah Ashcombe had spent the better part of the summer bending his attention. It was, Wren understood without ever having been told directly, the true reason the word encumbrance had entered a legal document that morning at all. A niece with no dowry and no immediate prospects was, in the particular mathematics of a desperate man, one more asset to be arranged advantageously if the opportunity presented itself, and a marriage settled quietly alongside a land settlement cost a guardian nothing but a little dignity he had already spent freely on worse. She walked the boundary alone that morning before the men arrived, as she often did, following the old sheep track along the hedge with the tin box once again warm in her apron pocket. And she noticed, as she always noticed, the things no one else in the household would trouble themselves to see, that the culvert she had cleared the previous spring was silting again and would want attention. Before the autumn rains, that a section of the boundary hedge had been quietly encroached upon by a full 6 feet on the Rathbourne side sometime in the last year, a fact that would matter a great deal once lawyers began drawing precise lines on precise maps. She did not mention either discovery to her uncle. There is a particular fatigue that settles into a person who has offered good counsel for years and watched it absorbed and unattributed, and Wren had begun, without quite deciding to, keeping certain observations to herself, not out of spite, but out of something closer to self-preservation. The way a candle is shielded from a draught, not from malice toward the room, but simply to keep it burning. The gentleman arrived a little after 2, Mr. Crane first in his dusty gig, with his ledgers wrapped in oilcloth against the threat of rain, and behind him the Duke's land agent, a brisk, weathered man named Halsey, who had ridden over from Rathbourne with 2 rolled surveys under his arm, and the settled patience of a man paid handsomely to be patient. Josiah met them at the gate with the particular warmth he reserved for men who might soon hand him money, and the party set off along the boundary track with Wren trailing a respectful distance behind, ostensibly to carry a basket of cold meat and bread for the men's refreshment, in practice because Josiah had never once managed to walk that boundary without eventually needing her to correct some detail he had gotten wrong and could not afford, in front of Halsey, to get wrong twice. It was Mr. Crane, pausing at the disputed hedge-line with the draft conveyance spread across a flat stone to weigh down against the wind, who made the mistake that afternoon of reading a clause aloud for Halsey's benefit, without first taking proper stock of who stood within hearing. Together with the encumbrance of one niece, Wren Ashcombe, presently 21 years of age, to be settled upon such terms as the parties shall agree, Mr. Crane read, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man reading a clause about drainage rights, and it was only as the last words left his mouth that he looked up and saw, standing not 6 feet away, with a basket of bread going cold in her hands, the very encumbrance in question. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock so much as the silence of men recalculating, very quickly, how much of what had just been said could plausibly be walked back. Halsey's eyes moved, once, from the paper to Wren's face and away again, the particular embarrassed swiftness of a man who has witnessed something he would very much prefer not to have witnessed. Josiah opened his mouth to speak and, finding no sentence in him equal to the moment, closed it again. Wren did not set down the basket. She did not turn her face away, and she did not, though her throat had gone tight and strange, allow a single sound to escape it that might have given the gathered men the satisfaction of watching her come apart over a paragraph. It was not admiration she felt in that suspended half-minute, watching her uncle's face work through several unconvincing expressions in search of one that might restore the afternoon to order. It was something colder and more exact, closer to recognition, the way one recognizes, at last and without surprise, a shape that has been visible under a sheet the whole time. There is a particular grief reserved for injuries a person has already privately absorbed, the narrator might have observed, in which the further public confirmation of the wound causes less pain than its original discovery, precisely because so much of the pain has already been spent. Josiah recovered first, as men in his position generally do, remarking with a laugh that did not travel past his teeth that it was merely a customary form of words, legal habit, nothing at all to trouble a sensible girl over, and Mr. Crane, grateful for the offered exit, agreed at once that it was merely form, merely custom, and folded the draft away with the brisk efficiency of a man burying something before it could be properly examined. Halsey said nothing further, though something in the set of his mouth suggested the matter had not, in fact, been buried nearly deep enough for his own comfort. No one apologized to Wren directly, because to apologize would have required first admitting that an apology was owed, and the afternoon simply resumed instead, the way afternoons in that family always resumed, moving forward across the wound as if it were merely a puddle in the path rather than a hole in the ground. The basket of bread was distributed, the hedge was measured. Somewhere behind them a bird went on singing, absurdly, indifferently, as though a clause read aloud over a stretch of marshy grass were the smallest event in the history of that particular hedgerow, which, in the ledger of the wider world, it almost certainly was. It was into the tail end of that same subdued, resettling afternoon that the Duke of Rathbourne himself arrived, unannounced and a full hour earlier than Josiah had been led to expect him, having decided, in the manner of a man accustomed to inconveniencing other people's schedules without a second thought, to ride over and see the disputed water meadow with his own eyes before signing away any part of his family's interest in it. Gideon Marloway had held the title only 4 years since his father's death, and had spent most of those 4 years being discussed in Fenmark drawing rooms with the particular mixture of fear and fascination reserved for men who are wealthy, unmarried, and almost entirely uninterested in being either admired or understood. He was not a large man, nor a loud one. His voice, when Wren first heard it that afternoon addressing Josiah's flustered welcome at the gate, was quiet in the way that made a room quiet around it rather than requiring volume to be obeyed, and he had a habit, she would come to notice, of allowing a silence to sit a beat longer than was comfortable before answering, as though weighing whether a reply was worth the trouble of giving. His eyes, when they passed briefly over the assembled party at the gate, gave away nothing at all, which she would later understand to be less a natural stillness than a discipline maintained at some cost, though on that first afternoon it read simply as coldness, the practiced coldness of a man who had learned early that warmth, offered carelessly, is very often mistaken for weakness by people eager to spend it. Josiah, caught entirely unprepared, launched into an apology for the state of the meadow and an explanation of the boundary hedge's history that grew more tangled the longer it continued, and it was in the middle of this tangle when Josiah confidently misstated the exact point at which the Rathbourne hedge had originally been planted. That wren, standing at the edge of the group with the empty basket still on her arm, said quietly and without any apparent wish to be noticed that the original hedge line had in fact run 6 feet further east along the old ditch that was still visible if one looked for it, and that the current hedge reflected an encroachment made sometime within the last year rather than any historical boundary at all. The words left her before she had fully decided to say them, the particular helpless honesty of a person who has spent a lifetime managing land and cannot, in the moment, watch it be described incorrectly without correcting the record, whatever the cost to her own comfort. Josiah's face colored. Halsey, to his credit, produced his survey at once and confirmed, after a moment's study, that the young lady was entirely correct. The Duke said nothing for a moment, and in that moment his attention, which had been fixed with polite indifference on Josiah, moved instead to Wren, and stayed there. It was not a long look. It could not, by the ordinary manners of that world, have been permitted to last more than a second or two before it would have become itself a kind of statement, and the Duke of Rathbourne was not a man who made statements he had not intended to make. But it was long enough. It was long enough that Wren felt it land somewhere beneath her collarbone with an unfamiliar weight, not admiration, not yet, but something closer to the sensation of being, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, actually seen rather than merely looked at. "You are certain of the ditch," he said at last, addressing her directly, which no one at that gate had expected him to do, and which caused Prudence, arriving belatedly and out of breath from the house at the news of his arrival, to go very still in the doorway behind them. "I have walked it a great many times, Your Grace," Wren said, which was truthful and also, in its modesty, a considerable understatement of exactly how many times and exactly how much of the estate's real business had passed, unrecorded, through her hands alone. "One must admire thoroughness," the Duke said, in a voice so dry it took Wren a moment to recognize the remark as something adjacent to wit, rather than simple observation, and there was, in the particular quality of the silence that followed it, an unmistakable sense that the joke had been made at Josiah's expense rather than hers. A small, unlicensed cruelty that would have been unforgivable from anyone of lesser standing, and was, from a duke, merely dry, the narrator might have noted, since rank, like everything else in that country, was permitted its opinions at a discount unavailable to the rest of the world. Josiah laughed a beat too late and a note too loud, the laugh of a man uncertain whether he has just been mocked, and Halsey, wisely, said nothing at all. Prudence recovered her composure enough to invite the Duke in for tea, an invitation he accepted with the same unreadable courtesy he had shown the hedge, and as the party turned back toward the house, Wren fell once more into her accustomed place at its edge, the basket empty on her arm, the tin box a small steady warmth against her hip, and told herself, with the particular firmness of a person arguing against her own hope, that a man's attention, however briefly given, changed nothing at all about the shape of her circumstances, and that she would do well to remember it. She did not entirely believe herself. That, too, she kept to herself, filed away in the private ledger no one else in the house had ever thought to open. Alongside the culvert she had cleared alone in the rain and the 6 feet of stolen hedge line, no one but she, and now, unaccountably, a duke, had troubled to notice at all. Tea in the yellow parlor that afternoon proceeded, on its surface, exactly as such occasions were meant to proceed, with Prudence pouring and Delphine performing and the Duke seated in the good chair by the window, answering every overture, with the same measured courtesy he might have shown a competent tradesman, warm enough not to give offense and cool enough to promise nothing. It was not the Duke's silence toward Delphine that Wren noticed most, though she noticed that too, filed away without quite admitting to herself that she was filing it. It was the small, deliberate way his attention kept returning to the corner of the room where she sat with the tea things, not lingering, never so long as to become remarkable, but returning all the same. The way a man's eyes return to a door he expects, without quite knowing why, someone useful to come through. "Do you find the county dull, Your Grace?" Delphine asked at one point, tilting her head in the particular way she had perfected before a looking-glass, having come to Rathbourne so recently from town. "Dull is a word for places with nothing to observe," the Duke said, and did not elaborate, and there was a beat of silence in which the room appeared to search for the compliment it assumed must be buried somewhere in the remark, and failed to locate one. Which was, Wren thought, very likely the entire design of the sentence. It was not admiration she felt, watching Delphine's smile hold its shape a moment too long against the disappointment beneath it. It was something closer to recognition, the quiet satisfaction of watching a performance fail against an audience it had not accounted for. A man who is difficult to charm is not the same as a man who is unfeeling, the narrator might have observed, though the distinction is one society is generally too impatient to make, preferring its dukes either warm or cold, and rarely troubling to notice the difference between reticence and ice. When at last he rose to take his leave, the Duke paused at the door long enough to address Wren directly a second time that day, which was, by the mathematics of that drawing room, itself a kind of event. "I understand you keep the estate's accounts as well as its hedges, Miss Ashcombe," he said. It was not quite a question. "Someone must, Your Grace," Wren answered, and offered nothing further, because a woman who has spent 3 years learning the cost of saying too much does not unlearn the habit merely because a duke has asked her a question in a pleasant voice. Something crossed his face at that, brief and unreadable, gone before she could name it, and then he was bowing to the room in general, and Josiah was seeing him to his horse with the particular obsequiousness of a man watching his own rescue ride away. And the parlor exhaled, all at once, the way a room does when its most demanding guest has finally gone. By the following week, the Duke had found no fewer than 3 further occasions to ride the boundary personally, rather than send Halsey in his place, each time arriving at an hour when the family's other occupations happened, by some accident he never remarked upon, to leave Wren free to walk the meadow with him and no one else. He asked about drainage. He asked, once, with the same dry economy he brought to everything, whether she had ever wished to see more of the county than its ditches, and Wren said that ditches had never yet disappointed her, which surprised a short, low sound out of him that was not quite a laugh, but stood, in a man so sparing with his amusement as its near relation. She began, without deciding to, cataloging these small exchanges the way she had once cataloged the household's unspoken debts, a private ledger of her own now, weighted not with grievance, but with something she did not yet have a name for, and was not eager to supply one. Because a name, once given, could be taken away again, and she had learned the hard way what happened to things in that house once they were named. Not admiration, not yet. she told herself, standing at the hedge one gray morning after he had ridden off toward Rathbourne, watching the shape of him diminish along the lane. Only recognition. It was easier, somehow, to hold the smaller word than the larger one, the way a coin is easier to hold than the debt it represents. The soil does not choose its seed, her mother's voice reminded her, unbidden, from some deep, undisturbed room of memory. It only learns in time to make room. And Wren wondered, walking back toward the house with the tin box knocking gently against her hip, whether that had ever once been true of anything so stubborn as a county. Or a family. Or a duke. The harvest supper at the Fenmark Assembly Rooms fell 3 weeks later, an occasion grand enough by local standards that even Josiah's debts could not keep the family from attending, and Wren went only because prudence judged her absence, this once, more remarkable than her presence, since word had gotten about that the Duke of Rathbourne had lately been seen more than once walking the Ishcombe. Boundary himself. The room that evening was strung with harvest garlands and lit by too many candles for the modest space, and it watched itself with the particular avidity of a county starved for a season of anything more interesting than weather. Every laugh pitched a half-tone higher than usual, every glance calculated for who else might be receiving one. Wren stood, as she generally stood at such gatherings, near the edge of things, in a gown twice turned and once more let out at the seam, a plain gray thing beside Delphine's new blue silk, and she caught, without meaning to, the particular way certain eyes slid toward her, and away again with the practiced blankness of people who have been discussing you and do not wish to be caught at it. Delphine found her within the first quarter hour, arriving at her elbow with 2 glasses of ratafia and the bright, solicitous smile she reserved for her cruelest observations. "I do think it is generous of the Duke," she said, handing Wren a glass she had not asked for, "to take such an interest in Uncle Josiah's little difficulties. Some men are drawn to a project, are they not?" It sounded like praise. The pressure beneath it was not praise at all, but an accusation dressed for company, the suggestion that whatever attention Wren had lately drawn was charity rather than regard, a kindness extended downward rather than an interest offered as between equals, and the distinction, though never spoken aloud, was the entire point of the sentence. One must be grateful for whatever interest one is offered. Wren said, and smiled, and did not say the dozen sharper things that rose and were set aside in the same half-second, that Delphine's own interest in the Duke had thus far produced nothing but dry courtesies she mistook for encouragement, that a project was at least a thing worth finishing, which was more than could be said of certain performances. She said none of it. She drank the ratafia she had not wanted and let Delphine believe the barb had landed unanswered, because there is a particular power, she had learned, in allowing an attacker to believe her arrow found nothing, when in fact it had simply been caught and quietly set down rather than thrown back. It was Delphine's second attempt of the evening, delivered a little later and a little louder, that drew an audience she had not accounted for. "One does wonder," Delphine said, to a small cluster of young ladies near the punch table, pitched just loud enough to carry, whether our cousin has been giving the Duke rather too generous an accounting of the estate's boundaries. One must admire creativity in a girl with so little else to recommend her. It was witty enough that a ripple of laughter went round the little cluster, not universal, but enough, the particular qualified laughter a county grants a favored girl's cruelty, when it has not yet decided whether cruelty is the fashion of the season. Wren felt the words land somewhere just beneath her ribs, precise and small, the kind of wound that does not bleed, but aches for days afterward, in a place no one else can see. She did not answer. She did not need to, because the Duke, who had been standing nearer the punch table than anyone had accounted for, turned his head at the words with the unhurried deliberation of a man who has heard something worth correcting and set down his glass. "Creativity," he repeated, in a voice that was not raised and did not need to be, is a rare enough quality in this room that I should be glad to know where to find more of it. Miss Ashcomb's accounting of the boundary was confirmed, I understand, by my own agent's survey within the hour. I had thought accuracy the rarer virtue, myself, but I am glad to hear creativity offered as the alternative explanation for being correct. The little cluster's laughter died at once, replaced by the particular silence of a room recalculating who precisely had just been made a fool of, and it was not Wren. Delphine's face, for one unguarded instant, showed something raw beneath the composure, quickly smoothed over into a laugh of her own, brittle and a beat too late. And Prudence, arriving at her daughter's elbow with the swiftness of a woman sensing disaster before she can name its shape, steered the conversation firmly toward the supper being served. The room, as rooms do, resumed its ordinary business within a minute. The fiddles struck up again, and no one but Wren seemed to notice that the Duke, having delivered his correction, did not linger to be thanked for it, did not so much as glance her way again for the remainder of the evening, as though the defense had cost him nothing and required no acknowledgment, which was. She would come to understand, very nearly the entire grammar of the man, that his kindnesses arrived unsigned, the way hers so often had, and that this, more than anything he might have said to her directly, was the thing that finally moved the word in her private ledger from recognition towards something she still refused, walking home in the dark beside her uncle's silent, brooding carriage. To call by its true name. It was not admiration Delphine felt that night, riding home in the same carriage with her jaw set and her hands folded too tightly in her lap. It is a peculiar arithmetic of certain hearts that public humiliation, rather than teaching humility, teaches only the address of its cause. And Delphine, replaying the Duke's cool sentence over and over in the dark of the carriage, arrived home with her grievance sharpened rather than blunted, certain in the particular unshakable way of a young woman who has never once been told no, that the fault lay entirely with the cousin who had somehow, without dowry or beauty or any right at all, contrived to be defended by a duke in front of the whole room. By the following fortnight the letter had arrived, delivered to Ashcombe Grange by the ordinary morning post, along with the household's ordinary correspondence, unsigned, the hand disguised into careful, joyless capitals that betrayed, in their very carefulness, the effort of someone unused to disguising anything at all. Josiah read it alone in his study first, and Wren, summoned an hour later by a housemaid with a face carefully arranged into no expression whatsoever, found him standing at his desk with the paper held at arm's length as though it might dirty his hands further the longer he held it close. "It has been suggested to me," he said, in a voice gone thin and strange, "that you moved the boundary marker yourself, Wren, under cover of night. That the encroachment you were so quick to point out to His Grace's agent was never an encroachment at all, but a device of your own manufacture, meant to ingratiate yourself with a man whose interest could do more for your circumstances than any dowry ever could." The letter, when he finally allowed her to read it, described the offense in exacting, damning detail, claiming to have witnessed her own figure at the hedge line on the night of the 15th, a gray shawl about her shoulders, working alone beneath a bright moon to shift the old stone 6 feet toward Rathbourne land, and closed with a flourish of concern so precisely pitched it might have been lifted whole from Prudence's own vocabulary, that the family's good name could not be expected to survive such a scandal reaching Rathbourne or Fenmark, or, worse, the ears of the very Duke whose good opinion the scheme had apparently been designed to win. Wren read it twice. She did not weep, though something in her chest had gone very cold and very still, the particular stillness of a person calculating, in real time, exactly how much of her life a single sheet of paper had just placed in jeopardy. It was not the accusation of dishonesty that frightened her most, though it was serious enough, a charge that could see her turned out of the only home she had, her reputation spoiled beyond any repair, a plain gray gown, and a steady hand at the household accounts could offer. It was the ease with which the room had already begun, in Josiah's shifting, unhappy eyes, to consider the accusation plausible, the particular readiness of a family long accustomed to viewing her as a liability to believe, at the first opportunity, that the liability had finally revealed its true nature. "I did not move the stone, Uncle," she said, and heard, even as she said it, how thin a denial sounds when weighed against a signed grievance, however anonymous, however disguised. "Someone has seen fit to accuse you of it in writing," Josiah said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted, and writing, once made, cannot easily be unmade. He did not accuse her outright of the deception. He did not, either, defend her outright against it, and it was in that particular unwillingness to choose a side, the narrator might have observed, that his complicity truly lived, not in cruelty spoken aloud, but in the comfortable, cowardly middle distance a man occupies when defending the truth would cost him something he is not yet prepared to spend. He informed her, before she left the study, that Mr. Hollis of Mead Farm, a widower of considerable acreage and considerably less charm, had lately expressed a willingness to overlook whatever talk might arise, should a match between them be settled quickly and quietly, before the scandal could travel further than the county's own gossip allowed, and Wren understood, standing very still with the letter's accusation still ringing in her ears, that her uncle had already begun, in the space of a single morning, converting her ruin into one more asset to be arranged advantageously. Not admiration, not fear, quite, though fear moved somewhere beneath it. What she felt, walking from that study with the tin box gripped so tightly in her apron pocket that the dented lid pressed a small bruised mark into her palm, was the unmistakable, cold-eyed clarity of a woman who has finally stopped waiting to be rescued and begun, instead, to calculate her own defense. The word had reached Rathbourne by the following day, carried, Wren later learned, by Halsey himself, who had received a copy of the same accusation, delivered anonymously to his own hand, addressed with a care that suggested its author wished the scandal to travel as widely and as quickly as possible. It was not humiliation exactly that Wren felt on learning this, standing at the kitchen window with the letter's contents already known to half of Fenmark by nightfall, though humiliation moved somewhere in the mixture. It was the particular, familiar ache of watching a good thing threatened before she had even permitted herself to call it good, the ache of a woman who has spent a lifetime deferring her own hopes to some safer, later hour, and now found that hour arriving early, uninvited, dressed as catastrophe rather than as promise. She did not know, that evening, whether the Duke had read the letter himself or only heard its substance second-hand, and the not knowing sat in her like a held breath she could not release. Tonight she would write to someone who might help her, she told herself, sitting at the small writing desk in her cold corridor room with a single candle burning low, though the someone she had in mind was not, in that first exhausted hour, the Duke at all, but a woman she had not seen in 3 years and had nearly given up hoping would ever answer a letter again. Great-aunt Honoria Ashcombe arrived at Ashcombe Grange 2 days later, entirely uninvited and entirely unannounced, in a carriage far grander than anything the Grange's own stables could have produced, and the house seemed to gather itself at the sound of the wheels on the gravel, the way a room gathers itself before a storm, servants straightening, Prudence's face draining of its usual composure. Josiah appearing in the front hall still fastening his waistcoat with the particular haste of a man caught unprepared by his own family. She was Edmund's aunt and Josiah's, older than either had lived to become, a tall, spare woman with iron-gray hair dressed with a severity that suggested she had never in her life wasted an hour on a fashion she did not respect. And she came through the front door with a small ivory-topped cane she did not appear to need for walking so much as for emphasis, tapping it once against the flagstones as she surveyed the assembled household with an expression that made plain, before she had said a single word, precisely how little of what she saw impressed her. "I have heard," she announced, before Josiah had gotten further than her name, "that my great-niece has been accused of moving a stone in the dark like a common thief, and I have come to see for myself whether the Ashcombe family has finally run entirely out of sense." It was not a question, and no one in the hall made the mistake of answering it as one. She found Wren within the quarter hour, having brushed past Prudence's offer of tea with the flat observation that tea had never yet solved anything that required solving, and took Wren's face between two dry, cool hands in the front parlor with a directness that undid, in a single gesture, 3 years of careful composure Wren had built specifically to withstand rooms like this one. "I do not need to see your evidence, child," Honoria said, before Wren had managed to produce a single word of defense. "I knew your mother. I have known you since you were an infant too small to hold your own head up, and I have never in 21 years known you to lie. Whereas I have known this family for considerably longer than that. To prefer a comfortable falsehood to an inconvenient truth whenever the choice presented itself." It was, Wren thought, the first time in 3 years that anyone in that house had extended her belief before requiring proof of it, and something in her chest held rigid for so long she had nearly forgotten it could move at all, loosened by a fraction she did not trust herself to examine too closely in front of witnesses. The letter itself, when Honoria finally sat down to study it properly at the parlor table that evening, with Wren on one side and summoned at Honoria's own brisk insistence, Beatrice Lowe on the other, proved less clever than its author had evidently believed. Honoria read it through twice in silence, her spectacles low on her nose, tapping one finger against the desk in a rhythm that seemed to keep time with some private calculation, and then read the crucial passage aloud a third time, slowly, as though testing each word for its weight. "A bright moon on the night of the 15th, she said. "Well, there it is." Wren did not understand at first what had been found, until Beatrice, who kept, as her father the tenant farmer did, a careful record of moon and weather for the planting calendar, produced from memory what the household's own almanac soon confirmed, that the 15th of that month had fallen 2 days before the new moon. A night of such complete and reported darkness that the mail coach itself had been delayed on the Fenmark Road for want of light to see the ruts. And further, that rain had fallen steadily from dusk until well past midnight, turning the very hedge track described in the letter into a stretch of mud no one could have crossed in a thin gray shawl without leaving a trail of evidence considerably more damning than a moved stone. "A woman does not work by moonlight on a night with no moon," Honoria said, folding her spectacles closed with a small decisive click. "Whoever wrote this letter has never once stood outside after dark long enough to notice the sky above her own head, which tells me a great deal about the sort of person who spends her evenings, instead, in front of a looking-glass." It was Wren, turning the page once more beneath the candlelight, who noticed the second thing, the phrase folded into the letter's closing flourish, the same dry, self-satisfied turn of words she had absorbed at the punch table not 3 weeks before, delivered then with a bright smile over a glass of ratafia. "One must admire creativity," the letter read, in a girl with so little else to recommend her. It was not a common phrase. It was not, Wren thought, turning the words over with the particular cold clarity of a person assembling a case rather than a grievance, a phrase she had ever heard from any mouth in that county but one. "She is not naming us," Honoria observed, watching Wren's face change, "but she has signed it all the same, hasn't she, in her own hand, without meaning to." There is always a stone left unmoved. In every lie of this kind, some detail its author was too pleased with herself to leave out, and it is always that detail, in the end, that undoes the rest of the structure. It is a comfort of a grim sort, the narrator might have observed, that deceit so rarely resists the temptation to be clever, and cleverness, unlike caution, always leaves a signature. Delphine did not confess outright when the family gathered the following morning in the small parlor, Josiah pale and unhappy at the mantel, Prudence twisting her handkerchief into a ruin in her lap, Honoria seated with the terrible upright patience of a woman who has already reached her verdict and is merely waiting for the room to catch up to it. She denied the letter was hers at first, denied any knowledge of the 15th, denied, with a brightness that had begun, for the first time in Wren's memory, to crack visibly at its edges, that she had ever uttered the phrase about creativity in any context whatsoever. Until Beatrice, quietly and without any apparent relish in the moment, observed that she had herself heard Delphine use those very words at the harvest supper, in front of no fewer than 5 other young ladies who would, if asked, very likely remember it exactly as she did. It was not a confession so much as a collapse, the particular unraveling of a person who has built an entire self around never once being caught and finds, in the moment of catching, that she has no other self prepared to take its place. "I only meant," Delphine began, and did not finish the sentence, because there was no version of its ending that would not have confirmed everything already understood in that room, and the silence that followed her unfinished defense was more damning than any accusation Honoria could have leveled against her. Josiah did not defend his daughter, and did not, either, apologize to his niece with anything approaching the fullness the moment required, offering instead a stiff, mumbled acknowledgement that a mistake had evidently been made, and that the matter would go no further, a sentence that managed, even in its brevity, to sound more concerned with containing the damage than with the harm already done. It is a family's particular gift, the narrator might have said, to mistake the ending of a scandal for the righting of its wrong, as though silence restored were the same as justice served. Honoria was not satisfied with silence. Before the morning was finished, she had extracted from Josiah, in the flat, immovable tone of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlived her own patience for masculine evasion decades earlier, a promise that Mr. Hollis of Mead Farm would hear nothing further of any proposed arrangement, that the letter's contents would be corrected wherever they had traveled, by Josiah's own hand if necessary, and that her great niece would not, so long as Honoria drew breath, be spoken of in that house again as anything so vile as an encumbrance. The word landed strangely in the room, spoken aloud by someone other than the family itself for the first time, and Wren, standing very still by the window with the tin box, a small, steady weight in her apron pocket, understood that something in the house's arithmetic had shifted, however slightly, however far it still had to travel, before the shift became anything like justice. What Honoria had not yet learned, and what Wren told her only that evening, once the parlor had emptied and the 2 of them sat alone by a low fire with a pot of tea neither had touched, was the earlier matter. The clause Mr. Crane had read aloud at the hedge weeks before, the word encumbrance appearing not merely in gossip now, but in ink, in a legal draft still, so far as Wren knew, sitting folded in her uncle's desk, awaiting only a signature to bind her future to whatever bargain Josiah's debts required of it. Honoria's face, on hearing it, went through no visible softening at all. Only a tightening. A stillness Wren recognized, having lately learned to read such stillness in another face entirely, as the particular quiet of a person too angry to trust herself with an immediate word. "Show me the deed," Honoria said at last, and there was nothing tart in it now, nothing aphoristic, only a flat, cold intention that Wren found, oddly, more reassuring than any comfort could have been. It was while Wren was retrieving the draft from where she had once glimpsed it beneath a stack of household ledgers, moving as quietly through the darkened study as 3 years of practiced invisibility had taught her to move through any room in that house, that the sound of a horse arriving at speed reached her through the study window. Too late in the evening and too urgent in its pace to belong to any ordinary caller, and beneath it, distant but unmistakable, the low first mutter of thunder rolling in from the direction of the river, as though the sky itself had chosen that particular hour to stop pretending patience. The horse that had arrived at such reckless speed belonged, Wren discovered within the minute, to no messenger and no tenant but to the Duke of Rathbourne himself, who came through the front door of Ashcombe Grange without waiting to be announced, his greatcoat dark and heavy with rain, his hair plastered flat against his forehead, a folded and rain-spotted sheaf of papers gripped in one hand as though he had carried it the whole ride pressed against his chest to keep it from the weather. The hall gathered itself around him the way a room gathers before a storm breaks rather than after, servants freezing mid-motion, Prudence appearing at the top of the stairs in her dressing gown with her hand at her throat, Josiah emerging from the study still fumbling with his waistcoat buttons, his face draining of color at the sight of who stood dripping on his good carpet at so unnatural an hour. "I have read your deed, my lord," the Duke said, and his voice, though quiet as it had always been, carried through that hall with a coldness none of them had yet heard from him, the particular coldness of a man who has spent an entire ride rehearsing his own restraint and has very nearly exhausted it. "I confess I had not troubled myself to read every clause of it before tonight. I have corrected that error." He did not wait for Josiah to answer. He unfolded the papers there in the hall, water still running from the hem of his coat onto the flagstones, and found, with the swift certainty of a man who has already marked the page in his memory, the clause near the document's close, and read it aloud in a voice that grew, with each word, more terrible for its refusal to rise. Together with the encumbrance of one niece, Wren Ashcombe, presently 21 years of age, to be settled upon such terms as the parties shall agree. He let the silence that followed sit a moment longer than was comfortable, the way he let every silence sit, and into that silence he said, quite simply, that he had not, in 24 years of managing land and tenants and every manner of legal instrument his family's holdings required, ever once seen a human being entered into a conveyance as though she were a right-of-way or a stand of timber, and that he did not intend to begin his acquaintance with the practice now. It was not a question. Josiah opened his mouth to offer some explanation about custom, about form, the same threadbare defense he had offered once already at a hedgerow weeks before, and found, under the Duke's flat, unblinking attention, that the explanation would not come. Wren, standing at the edge of the hall exactly where she always stood, at the edge of every room in that house, watched the Duke's hand tighten on the page, watched the muscle along his jaw work once, and then watched him do the thing she would remember longest of everything that happened that night. Longer even than what came after, he tore the clause from the document, cleanly, in one motion. The sound of the tearing paper, unnaturally loud in a hall, gone otherwise silent but for the rain against the windows, and folded the torn strip once and set it, without ceremony, into the fire that still smoldered low in the hall's grate, where it caught and curled and was gone inside a few seconds, as though it had never been written at all. "Draw the deed again without it," he said to Josiah, "or do not draw it at all, and I will take my custom to a man who does not require reminding that his niece is not for sale." It was Honoria, descending the stairs at last with her cane striking the treads in slow, deliberate emphasis, who broke what remained of the silence. "Well," she said, surveying the scene with the particular satisfaction of a woman watching a long-overdue reckoning arrive at last, "it appears the county has finally produced one gentleman with sense enough to read his own contracts." He asked, some minutes later, once the household had begun its unhappy scattering back toward whatever corners it could retreat into, whether he might have a word with Miss Ashcombe alone, and it was Honoria, of all people, who answered for the room, informing Josiah with a look that permitted no argument that the small study at the back of the house would do very well, and that the rest of them had urgent business elsewhere that could not possibly wait. The study Wren led him to was the same one in which she had, weeks before, first learned the word that had shaped her whole autumn, and there was a particular symmetry in that, she thought, standing near the cold hearth while he closed the door quietly behind them, shutting out the last murmur of the retreating household and leaving only the drum of rain against the window and somewhere beyond it, the low continuing growl of thunder moving off toward the river. A single lamp burned on the desk, throwing more shadow than light. It was, by the clock on the mantel, very near 2 in the morning. He did not come toward her at once. He stood some distance off, near the door still, his greatcoat dripping a small dark ring onto the floorboards, and when he finally spoke his voice had lost the coldness it had carried into the hall, had lost, too, something of its usual guarded evenness, so that what remained sounded, for the first time since she had known him, simply like a man, rather than like a title standing in front of one. "I did not ride here tonight for your uncle's land," he said, taking one measured step nearer as he said it. "I have wanted that water meadow since the spring, and I would have had it eventually, with or without tonight's unpleasantness, so you must not credit me with more urgency on that account than the matter deserves." He took another step. "I did not ride here because propriety required it of me, either, though I imagine half of Fenmark will decide by morning that it did, since propriety is a very convenient word for people who require an explanation more comfortable than the true one." Another step, and he was close enough now that the lamplight caught his face fully, close enough that Wren could see the rain still beaded along his jaw, could see, more than she had ever been permitted to see before, the effort it was costing him to say what he had evidently ridden through a storm to say. "And I did not ride here," he said, his voice dropping lower still, "because I believed for one moment that you had lied about a stone in the dark, because I have known since the first afternoon I stood at that hedge and heard you correct your own uncle in front of his solicitor that you are the single most honest person in this county, and very possibly the only one in that house who has never once told a comfortable lie to spare herself an inconvenient truth." He stopped, close enough now that she could have reached out and touched the damp wool of his sleeve and let a silence sit between them that was not, this time, a silence of withheld judgment, but of a man arriving, at last, at the sentence he had been circling since the hall. "I rode here," he said, "because I could not sit at Rathbourne on a night like this one and let you believe, even for a single additional hour, that anyone in this county had the right to call you an encumbrance, when you are the only reason that Meadow will ever hold water properly again, the only reason I have learned more about my own boundary in 4 months than my own agent taught me in as many years, and the only person I have met in this life who I find myself wanting to see. Not because there is business to discuss or a hedge to walk, but simply because the day is better for having her in it." Ren did not answer at once. There was a whole catalog of things she might have said in that moment, every one of them true, every one of them capable of ending the silence either kindly or cruelly. And she let each one rise and did not speak it, not out of the old fear that had once governed every word she gave a room, but out of something new, a wish to be certain, before she surrendered anything of herself, that what stood before her had been earned rather than merely offered. "You have known me 4 months, Your Grace," she said at last, and her voice, when it came, was steadier than she had expected it to be. "You have seen me manage a household's accounts, and correct a survey, and endure a letter accusing me of theft. You have not yet seen me idle, or unhappy, or wrong about anything of consequence, and I find I would like to be wanted for more than the version of myself that has only ever been useful." It was not a rejection. It was, and she watched him understand this even as she said it, a demand, the first demand she had allowed herself to make of anyone in longer than she could easily reckon. And something in his face eased at the hearing of it, as though he had expected exactly this and had, in some private way, been hoping for it. "Then let me be plain," he said. And here his voice found the shape it would carry for the rest of what he said. One clause built upon the last, each opening the same, each rejecting a little more of what a lesser man might have offered in its place. "I do not want you because the meadow will drain better for it, though it will. I do not want you because my mother has spent 2 seasons asking when I intend to marry, and I have grown weary of disappointing her, though I have. I do not want you because a duke is expected eventually to produce an heir and a hostess and a household run competently enough to survive his own indifference to it, though God knows this county would applaud the arrangement on exactly those grounds and never once trouble itself to ask whether either of us was happy in it. I want you," he said, and here he closed the last of the distance between them entirely, so that there was nothing left in the room but the lamp and the rain and the two of them standing close enough that she could hear the unevenness of his own breath. Because when no one else is watching, when there is no hedge to survey and no letter to answer, and no room full of people deciding what to make of us, I find that you are still the person I would rather be standing beside than any other person alive, and I have never in my life wanted anything so entirely for no reason but the wanting itself." It was not, when it finally came, the practiced eloquence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. It was, she understood, watching his hand rise and hesitate, and then simply open, palm up, between them, an offering rather than a claim, the voice of a man who had shed, for this 1 hour in this one room, every authority his name had ever afforded him, and was asking, plainly, humbly, to be answered as nothing more than himself. "Yes," Ren said, "because I wish it," and she put her hand into his without any further ceremony, watched his fingers close around it, not gripping, only holding, the way a person holds something they intend never carelessly to let fall, and felt, for the first time in longer than her private ledger could account, that the hand she had offered was not being weighed against anything at all, only kept. He did not let it go. He held it there in the lamplight while the storm outside continued to spend itself against the window, and when the tears finally came, unbidden and unstoppable and entirely unlike anything she had permitted herself in 3 years of careful composure, she did not turn her face away from him to hide them, because they were not, she understood even as they fell, a collapse of the self she had spent so long constructing, but simply the truth of everything she had carried finally finding its way to the surface, the way water finds. Eventually, whatever course has been waiting for it all along. He did not tell her to stop, he only tightened his hand very slightly around hers and said nothing at all, which was, of everything he had said that night, the thing she would remember most gratefully. The deed was redrawn within the fortnight. The Water Meadows lease settled on terms that owed nothing to any clause concerning nieces, and it was Honoria, installed at Ashcombe Grange with no apparent intention of ever leaving again, who oversaw both the legal correction and the rather more satisfying correction of Delphine's prospects, which shrank considerably once word of the letter's true authorship had finished its own slow circuit of Fenmark, a county that had proven, in the end, no more forgiving of a forger than it had once been careless of a forger's target. Mr. Hollis of Mead Farm, informed with some brevity that his overlooked scandal had never existed, transferred what remained of his interest to a widow 2 parishes over, and troubled Ashcombe Grange no further. Delphine did not vanish from the story, exactly, though her voice grew markedly quieter in it, her invitations to the better houses of the county thinning as the season turned, until by spring she had settled into the smaller, humbler orbit her own conduct had finally earned her. A fate the narrator might have observed was neither cruel nor especially remarkable, only just, which is very often the least dramatic and most durable form justice ever takes. The following spring, 9 months after a storm had broken over Ashcombe Grange and left it changed, the water meadow that had once been argued over in a lawyer's careful hand was cut through at last with the drainage channel Wren had first sketched in the margin of an old estate map 2 winters, before anyone of consequence had thought to ask her opinion of it, and the mill race it fed turned. For the first time, on a bright morning in April, before half the county and every tenant family whose fields the new channel would keep dry through the wet seasons to come. It had not been a small undertaking. There had been doubters enough at the outset, tenant farmers who muttered that no good ever came of digging where water had always been content to sit, neighboring landowners who predicted flood and ruin and said so freely at the Fenmark assembly rooms, and it was Wren's own quiet, patient explanations, delivered field by field over the course of a long winter, that had turned enough of that doubt into cautious cooperation to see the project through at all. By the morning of the opening, with the mill wheel groaning into its first slow turn, and a cheer going up from the assembled crowd that had gathered along both banks in their good coats despite the mud, even the loudest of the old doubters had nothing left to offer but grudging admiration, several of them observing to one another, within easy earshot of the family, that they had said all along the young mistress had a head for land that put half the gentlemen of the county to shame, a claim that would have astonished them all to hear repeated back to them from a season earlier, when the same mouths had called her nothing at all. It was there, on the bank above the turning wheel, with the crowd's chatter settling into an expectant hush as the Duke of Rathbourne climbed the low rise of ground where a rough platform of planks had been laid for the occasion, that the county gathered to hear him speak, and Wren, standing near enough to be seen but not so near as to seem staged for the purpose, watched the crowd's attention gather toward him the way a field of faces turns, almost against its own will, toward whatever light happens to be strongest in the room. "There was a season not so very long ago," he began, his quiet voice carrying further across that open ground than anyone would have credited, "in which most of you, and I will include myself among the number without complaint, looked at the woman who designed this channel and saw very little worth remarking upon. We were wrong." He let the sentence stand alone a moment, unhurried, the way he let every important sentence stand alone, and the crowd, sensing something larger arriving, grew quieter still. "She was called, in this county, a great many smaller words than she deserved," he said, "and I will not repeat the worst of them here, though I suspect a good many of you remember it as well as I do. What I did not understand then, and what I hope every person standing on this riverbank understands now, is that she was, in every particular that matters, exactly what this land needed, and precisely what it very nearly lost, through nothing more than our own carelessness in looking. She has a patience this county does not deserve, and a competence it very rarely troubles itself to reward, and a kindness that asks nothing in return. 3 things I have come to value above every acre I own, and I would rather stand beside her on a muddy riverbank than beside any more comfortable arrangement this world was prepared to offer me instead. The applause that followed was not the qualified, half-hearted laughter a county grants a favored girl's cruelty. It rose instead, genuine and unrehearsed, from tenant farmers and gentry alike. From Beatrice Lowe standing near the front, with her hands pressed to her mouth. From even Prudence, who had come to stand somewhat apart from her husband, with an expression that suggested 3 years of. Quiet complicity had finally cost her something she was only now beginning to reckon, and it rolled across the water meadow the way the floodwater itself would no longer be permitted to roll, contained now, directed, made useful at last rather than left to spoil what it touched. The soil does not choose its seed, the Duke said, when the applause had settled enough to let him finish. Borrowing, though only Wren understood at first where the words had come from, a homely truth I am told her own mother taught her in this very county years, before any of us thought to notice her at all. It only learns, in time, to make room. I hope this land remembers that lesson longer than the rest of us required to learn it. Wren, standing at the edge of the crowd exactly where she had always stood at the edge of every room, felt something in her chest come fully undone at the hearing of her mother's words spoken aloud in front of the whole assembled county, not stolen this time, not diminished, but returned to her whole and honored, and she reached, without quite deciding to, for the small dented tin box she still carried. Out of old habit, in her apron pocket, running her thumb once across its familiar scarred lid the way she had done in every hard hour of the last 3 years, except that this time the gesture was not one of endurance, but of simple, uncomplicated gladness. There was a ceremony that followed, small and unofficial, arranged by Honoria with the particular thoroughness of a woman who had appointed herself the family's late correction of every wrong it had allowed to stand too long, in which the seed tin itself was set, at Wren's own quiet insistence, into a small glass case built into the new mill house wall, alongside the very map on which she had first sketched the channel, so that any tenant passing through on ordinary business might see, without needing the story explained to them, that the land's good fortune had begun in the careful hand of a woman the county had once been content to overlook. It was not a grand monument. It did not need to be. A modest object, honestly kept, said more in that glass case than any portrait could have said from the east wall of Ashcombe Grange, and Wren, standing before it on the morning of its unveiling, thought that her mother, who had never once in her life asked for a portrait or a title or anything beyond a patch of good soil and an honest hand to work it, would have found the whole arrangement faintly absurd and entirely satisfying in equal measure. The wedding itself, when it came that same summer, was a smaller affair than the county had expected of a duke, held in the modest stone church at Fenmark rather than at Rathbourne's grander chapel, at Wren's own request, because she had told him, in the plain, unhurried way she told him most things now, that she would rather be married among the people who had watched the water meadow drained than among strangers who had only ever heard of it. He had agreed without argument, which she had come, in the months since a storm lashed night in a small, cold study, to understand was simply the shape of the man once he had decided a thing was right. Not loud in his agreement, not performative in his generosity, only quietly, steadily present, the way good drainage is present, doing its work without requiring applause for it. Honoria gave her away, having appointed herself to the office with the same brisk authority she brought to everything. remarking to anyone who asked that she had buried 2 husbands of her own and considered herself more than qualified to know a sound match when she finally saw one arrive in a family too slow to recognize its own good fortune. Delphine attended, seated near the back in a gown considerably plainer than the blue silk she had once worn to a harvest supper, and offered, afterward, a congratulation so evidently sincere in its discomfort that Wren found she could accept it without any bitterness at all, understanding at last that the truest revenge available to her had never been Delphine's humiliation, but simply the ordinary, undramatic fact of her own happiness, which required no audience to be complete. Josiah wept at the church door, an unlovely, undignified weeping that surprised even himself, and said, taking his niece's hands in both of his own for the first time in longer than either of them could easily remember, that he was sorry, not eloquently, not at length, but plainly, which was, Wren thought, very nearly the first entirely honest sentence he had offered her since her father died, and worth more for its plainness than any grander apology could have been. It was not, in the years that followed, a marriage without its ordinary difficulties, its small disagreements over tenants and accounts and the proper way to manage a stubborn hedge, its seasons of worry when the harvest ran thin or the roads flooded despite every careful channel dug against them. It was not perfect. It was not, in the particular quiet honesty Wren had carried with her since a girl kneeling beside a bed of columbine, ever meant to be perfect, because perfection had never once been the promise either of them had made the other in a small, cold study at 2 a.m, with the rain still falling outside. It was simply shared, the accounts and the hedges and the long, slow work of a land finally being tended by 2 people who had each, in their own separate ways, learned the cost of going unseen, and that, in the end, on every morning she woke in the gray light of Rathbourne, with his hand still loosely closed around hers. The way it had first closed around hers on the night the deed was torn proved more than enough. On the morning the last of the summer storms finally broke over the county, clearing by dawn into the particular clean gold light that comes only after a night of hard weather, Wren stood at the window of the room that had once been her own cold corner of a house that never warmed for her, and watched the water meadow catch the early sun along its new straight channel, silver and steady and entirely unremarkable to anyone who had not watched it. For one long autumn and the winter that followed nearly cost her everything to earn. Gideon found her there, as he so often did in that quiet hour before the house woke, and said nothing at first, only came to stand beside her at the glass, his hand finding hers without either of them needing to look to know it would be there. And it was in that ordinary, wordless, dawn-lit stillness, more than in any speech delivered to a crowd or any clause torn from a legal page, that Wren understood at last the whole of what her mother's small-worn saying had always been trying to tell her, that she had never once needed the world's permission to be worth something, only the patience to wait, with her hand open, for a world slow enough to learn, in its own crooked time, to make room.